morning, everyone out there in Coffee Math Magic Land. Thank you so much for joining me today. Yes, today is going to be the very short history of coffee. I'm saying that just because it does stretch across a long period of time, but my knowledge, I'm trying to be humble here. My knowledge of it is really passing. We could have conversations and conversations, and folks have written books and books about the history of coffee. Um, but as I was thinking about what I want to share with you today, I realized there is something that we do when we do tours that we always have a part of, which is the history of coffee. And I haven't shared that with anybody in like 3 months now. So, again, even when I give the tour, it is still a relatively fast version of this. Now, also know, um, hello watching now people, says Eric. Yes, hello to you, Eric. So just know, as I go through this relatively quickly, there are little stories embedded within each of these big kind of arcs I'm going to talk about that are fascinating. And I'll be very, very frank, they often involve intrigue and spies and stealing. And of course, we also know that coffee's history as an agricultural product is bound up with economics, with colonialism, with issues of the global north and the global south. Do not wish to in any way gloss over those in talking about the history of coffee. Those are important subjects, and we always have to be open to discussing them frankly, right? What we're talking about today is just our understanding of how coffee was first discovered and how it moved around the globe, right? So again, within these kind of broad sweeps of history I'm going to talk about, there are all sorts of smaller stories embedded in there which are fascinating. They have personalities, and they represent the times in which they occurred, and they represent also cultures kind of clashing, and they represent wars also. There's that's embedded in this history, and the travel of this commodity, what was once for sure a commodity, is also a story of the product, in a sense, kind of changing across time as well, which I might talk a little bit about. And it's kind of a full circle experience, I think. So that's just a way of kind of giving an introduction to what I want to talk about today. Again, so I want to make sure everyone understands that I'm going to talk really fairly briefly about this. Also know that I'm limited in my own knowledge, and I'm always looking to learn and read more. And then we'll follow up in comments after we publish today with some reading recommendations that we have. I know that everybody at Batdorf has read several of the books that I've drawn some of this information from, but we'll make sure to get some links to those maybe as we move forward over the next couple of days. You can check back in the comments on this video. So, how do we start? Well, as always, we should probably start with some coffee. Let's see if I have this. Nope, not pulled up. No worries. Nope. No worries. I do have some coffee over here that I'm brewing, but I'm not able to show it to you. But that's okay. You'll see me making it. I am brewing some of our Ethiopia Guji. Now, why would I choose that coffee to brew this morning and talking about the history of coffee? Now, a lot of you probably know the answer to that already, right? When we start talking about coffee, we're going to start by talking about the origin of coffee, or at least the origin as we understand it. So, some of you probably are aware of the name of our coffee bars, Dancing Goats Coffee Bars. So if we think about our dancing goats, where do the dancing goats come from? Right? Let's shrink them down. Boop, boop, boop. Do, 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 do. That's right. Here we are. Where are we, though? That's the question. Let's get that. Let's shrink this map down a little bit. So, here we are. When we think about our dancing goats, where they come from, we talk about the dancing goats as coming from what is currently Ethiopia, right? And what do the dancing goats refer to? Well, you've probably heard before. We've told the story of a goat herd named Kaldi who was looking for. He could not find his goats. He was searching for them. He hears their bells eventually, and he finds them. And the goats are dancing around this bush, and they're eating the leaves and the fruit off of that bush. Well, that bush is, of course, a coffee tree. So that is when we think of humans first discovering coffee. It's with that kind of classic way that humans have interacted with their food sources for recorded history and before, right? You see an animal eating it. Animal seems fine. In fact, this animal is dancing around and is excited. So, what's going on there? So, of course, Kaldi pops one of those sweet little fruits into his mouth. And it is sweet. And chews it up. We laugh now. He spits the seed out probably, right? And, of course, experiences this invigorating effect. So, coffee was discovered as a fruit on a tree in the highlands of Africa, in Ethiopia, and in East Africa, and humans began using it, right? Because they recognized pretty quickly that it has these invigorating, pleasant experiences. That, of course, is the caffeine. It's present in the leaves. It's present in the fruit as well, and of course, it's present in that little seed that he spit out. So, we will locate our first important aspect. Oh, I keep trying to interact with the map on my OBS. Okay, sorry about that, folks. In Ethiopia. Okay, so where do we go next? Well, we travel a little ways here to Yemen. So when we talk about coffee being an agricultural product, we have to travel across this gulf here to Yemen. And it was in Yemen, or it was present-day Yemen, that we understand that coffee was first grown as an agricultural product, right? And probably more importantly, not just an agricultural product. I'm sure there were people who were planting and growing coffee in Ethiopia before that, but really as a market product, right? It's as something that's being grown, harvested, and then sold and distributed, right? So it is there at the tip of the peninsula, the Arabian Peninsula, that we can imagine that the coffee world that we are more familiar with first begins. This is coffee being grown, harvested, processed with the dry method, right, that we talk about, and then sold, right? And at this point, humans have gone from just eating the fruit and the leaves to understanding that seed there could be cooked and then ground and a drink could be made from it, right? So that's a huge shift in what we understand coffee to be now. It's the fruit is not necessarily the thing that we're growing the coffee for. We're trying to get down to that seed, which we've learned now can be roasted. And then roasted, pulverized, water can be passed over it, and then you get this drink, this resulting drink. So, I'm going to bring up some images here. So, we now have coffee spreading across what we would call, one word for it is the Near East, right? So, We have coffee in Syria, Turkey, right? Oh, whoopsie daisy. I keep learning how to use this tool here as we speak. It's in Egypt. It's going to make it all the way across the top of Africa, right? It's going to obviously make its way into what at the time was called Persia, right? It's still Persia, right? Iran, and it's going to spread through this area here in what become called coffee houses, right? This space where people come and to drink coffee, and again, they're experiencing this enlivening of the mind and this, you know, quickening of the tongue, perhaps in speech, right? So folks are coming together to share coffee, in an environment where they might also listen to music and they might hear the news, and so the coffee culture, the coffee house culture, spreads through all of these areas which are part of an Islamic empire. And it is at this point, firmly established commodity. This is in the 16th and 17th century. This coffee was super popular, right? And it is, it has some controversies, of course, in its history in Islam. Sometimes it is the coffee houses at one point in Egypt were considered to be a nuisance, and there were attempts to outlaw them, but people weren't having it. It was too popular, right? So even attempts to control this coffee, which is, even then being associated with the coffee houses where people are talking politics and religion and science, and it is seen as something which, attracts a certain way of being when people get together to drink it. But it's too popular. So spreads and is very valuable. Now, at the same time, 17th century, end of the 16th century, 17th century, we have these folks. Oh, Europeans, look at those wigs. Oh, they're amazing. So coffee makes its way into Europe, right? So let's, oh, gosh darn it, I keep forgetting I have to switch my thing here. All right, there. So, and so coffee houses start popping up all over in Europe. So at one point in London, there were, and in what is now the United Kingdom and England, there were close to 1,000 coffee houses. Some of the first people to really catch on to this were in the Netherlands, right? Because they were traders. They had a very well-established series of trade networks. They had come into contact with it in the Near East. People were discussing this, fascinating drink that is so popular in the Near East, and so those traders bring it back to the Netherlands, of course, Belgium, France. It begins making its way into what effectively becomes coffee house cultures in Europe, right? Now, at this time, though, we need to remember that even though it was very popular and they had these coffee house cultures in Europe, here we have these fine gentlemen. Gosh knows how they're making that coffee. I'm a little nervous. We don't think they quite understood the science of it, but what they did understand was that they liked the flavor, which is fine enough, and they also liked the effect, right, that it had. It begins to supplant in Europe what had been the standard morning beverage, which was ale, mead or wine, alcoholic beverages. Again, out of these coffee houses in Europe, in this case, I believe this one's in England, they start, creating new forms of business. Lloyd's of London, for example, a famous insurance company associated with international trade, came from a London coffee house. So remember though, all the coffee that is being purchased, roasted, and then drunk in Europe is still being traded through the Arabian Peninsula, right? Still locating here. And a lot of, and the growth and access to it is still down here. So that presents a certain problem for the European traders and powers that be. They would like to have coffee of their own. So the first folks to consider this, here we have a little image here of, look at this fellow here. Oh my, that face! What a sour-looking face he has. You will see here that we have, in this case, some Dutch traders interacting with coffee in a coffee house, and they have decided that they need to get their hands on the coffee. Now, at this point, the trade in coffee is being very tightly controlled. You can take the seed of coffee as a green seed, and you can apply a little bit of moist heat to it, steam it really, and make it so that it can no longer germinate, right? So now you have the seed, but you cannot plant the seed, right? So it's funny to think of this, but that controlled the ability for other people to take that coffee and plant it wherever they wanted to. Well, of course, it's only going to be a matter of time before that changes. The Dutch do obtain some viable coffee, and the first place where they attempt to grow it is in India. And there's a famous story of an Indian monk who smuggled coffee out of Yemen, and eventually Dutch traders get their hands on it. They attempt to grow it in India. Does not work, but where they are able to go, of course, is here, right? So to Java, East Java, right? So we'll call this whole area here the area of influence of the Dutch, what are at that point called the Dutch East Indies, right? So the Dutch are able to take coffee and begin growing it themselves as an agricultural product, and selling it at that point, which is great news for them, right? They now have what's called vertical alignment. They have the ability to grow the product, to transport it, and to put it into the marketplace back in Europe. So some of the people who were not so happy about that would be some of the people that they are in competition with on the world stage, the French, the English, to the most part. And it again is simply a matter of time before this fellow here got his hands on it. So it was in the 17th century that the mayor of Amsterdam, as a polite gesture, gives a beautiful tree to the King of France. It was Louis XIV, and they plant it in the botanical garden. Now remember, in order for coffee to grow in essentially what is France is middle Europe, but is far above what we know is the ideal growing zone for coffee, right? So the equator down here, right, and the tropics above and below it. So this belt that runs right along here is where we can grow coffee effectively at the right altitude. They can't do that in Europe, so they plant it in what was, I'm sure, magnificent botanical garden, which you can visit today. And you can actually go see in both Amsterdam and France the remnants of these early trees that were given. But they planted in the Royal Botanical Garden in Paris, and then in the early 1700s, a naval officer is charged by the king to take the coffee to. I'm going to change maps here real quick. Martinique, and you can see a little pin there, and we'll zip down on it here. So first of all, you can see where there's France, and they travel all the way over here. And so now, just as the Dutch are taking coffee to their colonial holdings in the Dutch East Indies, now we have the French bringing coffee to their sphere of control, which in this case is this little island right here, Martinique. Look at that. And from here, which we'll zip over to this map again, all the way down here. So from here, just put a little circle here. We then begin to witness the spread of coffee across the Americas. And really, if you look across all of our coffee offerings, you'll see we of course work with a lot of farmers in the Americas. Now, there's another story of how, of course, in Brazil, this is not the French, but the Portuguese, how it is they obtained coffee. And again, it was not legitimately, it was through the legend, or the apocryphal story is that it was a Dutch officer who was very handsome, charming the wife of a Caribbean mayor. And I'll just leave it at that. But essentially, it was remember, series of plants that leave from France, travel to Martinique, then spread out, and then just some seeds given to one person. We think it probably is what gave rise to the Brazilian coffee industry, which of course Brazil is the top producer of coffee on the planet now. So, but yeah, we know now that the coffee then spreads to all these areas, right? All across the Americas, right? And so we have coffee now growing all the way down through Central America, down into Colombia. We of course have Brazil as the premier producer of coffee on the planet. So I'm going to go back out here so we can take a quick look. Coffee has made its way into the Americas as well. And just taking a look at the little marker there of where coffee begins. Its first little step right across that little gulf there into Yemen. And then from Yemen, it circles out through the areas of land controlled by through Islam, through the Islamic culture, where it finds a root in the coffee houses. Eventually, traders interact with that from Europe, and similar clusters of very, very popular coffee houses grow in Europe. And then European traders from that point then, through a series of mishaps, scandals, and in some cases, outright war, travel with coffee to the East Indies and to the Americas. And from that place, then we get this massive industry that we get to be a part of. That is a super quick history overview, not a history, an overview of coffee. Now I want to let you know that the producers have brought in some links here. Please check them out. There's a link about the Dutch bringing coffee to Sumatra. There's a question here from someone about Yemen coffee comes from East Africa. So, yes. Now, there are. So we talk about two commercially viable forms of coffee that we have today. We have Café Arabica and Café Robusta. Those are the two kind of big categories of coffee that are drunk around the world. 70% of that market, more or less, is the Arabica, the coffee that we purchase. And we purchase, of course, just the very top end of that for quality. But then 30% is Robusta. And those are two slightly different species within Café. There are, though, other forms of of cafea that are out in the wild, whether they're land races or just naturally occurring mutations of the same parents. Now, coffee is brought physically from Ethiopia to be planted, and then from that point on, there we of course begin a series of what are called sub varieties or varieties of that same Cafea arabica. And you'll often, when you read our coffee reports, Bob will usually list what the varieties are. And there's a tree, which I'm not going to find for you right now, but maybe we can have another conversation about varieties. That would be a great conversation with Bob to talk about the varieties of coffee that have really are, to the most part, human designed. Just the standard thing that we do with plants that are agricultural products is we take cuttings and we graft things together, and we work on noticing natural mutations. So all those things have played a part in how coffee is developed as in order to increase its yield, to increase certain flavor qualities, to increase natural abilities as to fight back insects and disease. Humans, since it is such a big industry and there's so much money in the industry, of course, a lot of science and agronomy has gone into working with coffee plants and creating varieties that will fit needs, right? But yes, the answer to the question is, yeah, coffee in Yemen came from East Africa in that sense. That's not to say there might not have been varieties of coffee or species of coffee in Yemen, but as far as an agricultural product being specifically planted by humans, tended, cultivated, and worked with nurseries and all of the things we recognize as part of coffee and processing, getting the fruit off to get to the seed, those original coffees come from Africa. And that's why we celebrate coffees from Africa. I love this as a naturally processed coffee. It's fantastic. Let's see, there's a new message down here. There's a link to the Whirling Dervish blend that we have, which it's the namesake of that coffee. Just like Dancing Goats is the namesake of the discovery of coffee, Whirling Dervish really is a namesake to that transition point where humans realized they shouldn't just chew on the fruit to get the coffee; they could get down to the seed. So okay, somebody's making jokes that I don't quite understand in the feed, but that's okay. That's okay. I'll go back and I'm sure I'll figure it out eventually. Yes, again, quick history of coffee. I said I wanted to do a kind of a full circle here. So if you remember when we talk about the first coffee houses, there were these places where people met and gathered to have interaction and talk about art, science, politics, religion, right? All important issues, and they circled around coffee to do that. We know that coffee, of course, then bloomed in the same way in Europe, no pun intended, and then, of course, became a world commodity. And a commodity is a bit different than something that we like to consider coffee as. We consider it as a culinary item. But for a long period of time, from the 1800s into the mid 1900s, coffee really was, people enjoyed it, of course, and it was that thing you drank in the morning. But, our grandparents, for example, here in the US, had a different understanding of coffee, right? It was, good coffee. Sure, people said that's a good cup of coffee, right? But it was, coffee houses weren't really the thing. You came to, you had coffee at a diner or coffee at a restaurant, of course. You had coffee in your home, but the coffee house wasn't as much of a thing. And there was really a rebirth and a revitalization of that in the 1960s, late 1950s into the 60s, in which here in the U.S. at least, there started to be a reawakening of what a coffee house could be, right? So, and that's another whole other topic we could talk about. I know that we're really proud to call our kind of our founding store in Olympia the coffee house, because it's about that place that's being created to come and enjoy coffee, not just for coffee's sake, but also for the community of people around it that is created, and that it's a celebration of coffee house culture. Some might call it cafe culture. I like to call it coffee house culture because again, it feels like we're coming full circle back around to that place that coffee occupied as it was first, gaining in popularity among people, and how it was experienced, how a coffee house was experienced, is different from culture to culture, but there are some things which we absolutely hold on to, which are the same, right? And so we're really grateful that those of us who get to work in coffee have you, our friends, who love joining us here in this space. And we've been trying to recreate that space here with these videos and on these platforms. So I hope they've been of great value to you. And if you need coffee, this is the time when I always want to make sure to remind you to, by all means, go online. There's been some links to our blogs, which I'd love for you to go read those, because we've written about this stuff before. But while you're there, if you need coffee, please, because you've come and joined us in this space, we want to make sure that you make use of a discount for buying coffee. Right, so 10% off if you use the code Watch and Learn 10 when you buy coffee from us. We really appreciate you joining us in these spaces, coming here every day, learning with us, and we hope that you have a great next few days. And I hope to see you here next week as we continue to turn our homes into coffee houses.